Welcome to the launch of the U.S. Department of Transportation's Project Delivery Center of Excellence and our new 8-part thought leadership series on delivering the benefits of the bipartisan infrastructure law. I'm Ann Aylward, Director of the U.S. Department of Transportation's Volpe National Transportation Systems Center. The Volpe Center has already gotten to work on developing this new Center of Excellence in cooperation with our colleagues at USDOT, and we look forward to working with all of you in the months ahead. We've had a great turnout for today's kickoff, including representatives from across the transportation enterprise. We're delighted so many of you from state, regional, tribal, local, territorial, and federal agencies and governments are joining us today, as well as those of you working at nonprofit organizations in the private sector, academia, and our colleagues from abroad. We're honored that U.S. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg is with us for today's kickoff, and joining him is Bent Flupierre, Chair of Major Program Management at the University of Oxford's Said Business School, and the Willem Kahn Rasmussen Professor and Chair at the IT University of Copenhagen. The Secretary will now deliver remarks. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Secretary.
Well, thanks very much, Ann, for all the great work that you are doing leading the Volpe Center, and to everybody who is there and everybody among my colleagues around the country who is joining today. I've really been looking forward to this. In fact, there are two things today I've really been looking forward to. One, of course, is the launch of this Project Delivery Center of Excellence, something that is timely, that is needed, and that I think is going to do an enormous amount of good. And so it's so exciting to see that coming together. And secondly, I'm very pleased virtually to be joining somebody whose work I've followed with great interest in Professor Flupierre. When it first became apparent that we as a country were likely to pass what became the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill that is, of course, one of the signature accomplishments of this administration, it became immediately clear that one of the biggest challenges we were going to have is actually delivering on that. And while getting the funding is the step that has escaped many administrations and escaped this country for many years, the truth is that's only the beginning, and delivery and management are enormously important. So I have had, since those early days when we were contemplating the bill, a large brick of a book on my desk that is called the Oxford Handbook of Mega Project Management, edited by Professor Flupierre, which includes a deep academic literature on this, the question that can be expressed pretty simply, which is, why is it that very big and difficult things almost always come in late and over budget, and sometimes don't even deliver the intended benefits, and how do you beat that? Thankfully, he has a more popular and digestible work out recently that builds on those findings. And so I thought it would be a great opportunity for us to tap his mind. Professor, thanks so much for joining us and sharing your time with us and our colleagues today. And I want to thank everyone who's joining us. I know we have federal, state, local, tribal governments. We have academia represented here, industry, nonprofits, and more. So I want to thank all of you for your interest and your commitment to delivering better transportation systems in this country. I'll be very brief because I really am eager to get to the conversation, but I just want to reflect that the very passage of the president's infrastructure law marks something of a modern miracle in the politics of today's Washington. I think the fact that we had a generational undertaking of this scope and scale gets support from both sides of the aisle tells you just how important this work is. Many said that it would not be possible. It was declared dead many times, but President Biden believed in this work. And I know many of you were part of the story of how we got that bill through. But what we really need from you is to be part of the story of how we make good on its potential. Even $1.2 trillion can go out the door pretty quickly without the intended benefits if we're not intentional about how to get the absolute most of it. We've already identified over 35,000 projects in some 4,500 communities across every state and territory. We have been there for award announcements, groundbreakings. Actually, Friday, for the first time, I'll be at a ribbon cutting on a project that was funded partly by the infrastructure law, which will be the first of what we hope will be very many. But we're on a curve, we're on a path here. Year one, so much of our effort in this administration was getting the bill passed. And last year, a great deal of our effort was directed toward standing up programs that hadn't existed before that were funded by that bill. If year one was the bill passing and year two was the programs launching, we are squarely in the middle of years 3 and 4 and beyond, which will be about the money moving and the dirt flying. And we know the urgency of that work, whether we get news of a bridge collapse in Pittsburgh or roads being destroyed by floods in Vermont that we know are going to become more frequent as climate change accelerates, or whether we confront the slow motion crises like the loss of life in roadway crashes in this country every day. We see the challenges in front of us, and we know what's at stake in getting every penny's worth of value out of the roughly half of that $1.2 trillion that has been assigned to us in the transportation world. And I'm talking about us in the transportation world, not just us in the transportation department, because over 90% of the funding that flows through the plumbing, so to speak, of our department will ultimately be delivered by non-federal entities like some of those that we've gathered today on this call. The transit agencies, the airports, the state departments of transportation, the cities, those who must deliver. But we are here with you in that process as well. You understand the complexity of it, and you also understand the importance of it. We are optimistic about what can be done, but we also know that it won't happen on its own. So this US DOT Project Delivery Center of Excellence that we are launching is important because it is so important to deliver good projects well, meaning on time, on task, and on budget. And the Volpe Center is such a great place to host this thought leadership because you've already been thought leaders for our department and an extraordinary global hub for transportation expertise. And I know that in the months ahead, the Center of Excellence at Volpe will only continue to grow and evolve in this purpose of better supporting project delivery staff, project sponsors, and everyone working on this both inside and outside of the department. Importantly, the new Center of Excellence will work to capture, highlight, and share best practices for project delivery starting today with the center's new website and toolbox. So strongly encourage everyone following this presentation to have a look at the first iteration of that work at projectdelivery.dot.gov and communicate to us what other resources would be helpful to include, because our library of information and best practices should only continue to grow over time, and we want it to be useful to you. And this is going to be about not just thought leadership, but accelerating and improving project delivery practices in practical terms. Today begins that effort, and there will be so many opportunities in the months to come for leaders like those here to exchange ideas, share knowledge, and learn from one another through web events like this one, trainings, conversations, and as we work toward completion of the new physical home of the Volpe Center, more convenings as well that we're really looking forward to. So here we are after years of so-called infrastructure weeks that came and went without result, with the best chance probably in our lifetimes in the United States to transform our transportation systems to the better, to make communities safer, to make transportation cleaner, to advance equity, and to connect people to the resources, the opportunities, and the jobs that are going to shape their lives. And I'm very much looking forward to continuing that work together, and can't think of a better way to kick off this piece of it than today's event. So with that, thank you all again. And Anne, back over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. And thank you for the kind words. We're looking forward to welcoming you to our ribbon cutting for our new facility in September. So thank you for your commitment and leadership, also for the new Center of Excellence, and for including the Volpe Center in this exciting new initiative. Before I turn things over to the Secretary and Professor Flu-Pierre, please know, all of you on the call, that you can type your questions into the Q&A box, and there will be a period for questions and answers following the conversation. So back to you, Mr. Secretary.
Great. Well, thanks again, Anne, and thank you again, Professor, for joining us. And I'd love to jump right into a substantive discussion that I hope will share some of your insights with the community of practice that is out here, very much working on the thing that you are among the world's leading experts on, which is how to get big things done, and how to get big things done on time and in the way that was intended. And part of what has interested me about your studies is that you've looked through so many of the cases where things did and didn't go well. So much so that you've built data sets that have statistically significant subsets and patterns in terms of projects, from private sector projects like film production to energy sector projects like building nuclear power plants, to the transportation projects that so many of us in this setting are very focused on. So I would begin by the question of beginning projects, starting projects the right way. This is one thing that the Center of Excellence will focus on a lot, which is before you, and I will admit, I'm among those figures who probably express a great deal of impatience, which can be a risky thing on getting dirt flying, or as President Biden would say, when we can turn a spade. But before you first turn a spade, a lot has to be done, and you've written a lot on what you call slow thinking prior to acting fast to deliver. So let me begin by asking you to share a little more about what needs to happen first and how to think about the difference between everything that happens before you move dirt and everything that happens next.
Right. Yeah. First, thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, it sounds like a paradox, but if you want to go fast, you got to go slow first. That's something that is very well established in behavioral science. We as humans have a propensity, a cognitive bias, the psychologists call it, for just getting ahead with things. And you know, there are good evolutionary reasons for that. If you meet a lion on the savannah, you want to make a quick decision and you want to get away, right? But if you are investing $1.2 trillion, that's a different situation. You actually want to put some thinking into that, and not just for the whole amount, but for each project that goes into spending that money. And what we see in a lot of projects is that people run with the first idea quickly, because that's what we are hardwired to do. It's called availability bias. And what we need to do is slow down in order to bracket that availability bias and think about what is it we are doing here. And the most important question is actually, why are we doing this? So for each project, you need to be clear about your why. And that's actually the question to start with, to ask, why are we doing this project, and find good answers to this question. Then once you've got that question answered, and it's not a question you answer just once, you go back and forth, you have lots of different stakeholders helping you answer the question and so on. And once you have a solid answer, you begin to what we call think from right to left. You put it on the right of your project chart, and then you think backwards. You think, what are the things that we need to do moving backwards in order to arrive at this outcome that we have now decided that we want to do. So those are two elements that go into thinking slow, is to spend a substantial amount of time thinking about why are we doing this project, and then a substantial amount of time figuring out how do we get to the outcome that we have now decided that we want to arrive at. And then when you get into the delivery process, you want to make sure that you keep your eyes on the outcome all the time. No matter where you are in the delivery process, you look at the right of the diagram, to the outcome. And that will help you know that you're always doing the right thing, and that you can actually move ahead fast because you always know what you're doing, and it's well thought out and it's well programmed.
I would love to unpack a little bit this idea of interrogating the why, because I think often we come to projects and at first the why seems very obvious. Why do we do this project? Well, we need to fix this bridge. And sometimes that is self-evident. Other times there might be a deeper question about why the bridge needs to be fixed or why the bridge needs to be there. So I wonder if there are any examples from your work that might show what level of imagination is needed to really approach that question of why in a responsible way that could make a difference toward the ultimate delivery and success of the project.
Yeah, so a specific example, not from transportation, but from building, is the Canadian American architect Frank Gehry was asked to do a Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, and he was invited by the city and regional government of the Basque region and Bilbao to visit, to discuss whether he would be interested in being the architect of a new Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao. And the government had already decided, which building they wanted to be the new Guggenheim. And of course, they showed the building to Gehry, and this was a fine old building, an old winery. And what the city government and regional government told Gary is, we want a building that can do for Bilbao and the Basque region what the Sydney Opera House did for Sydney. So like really put them on the map. And Gary said, I actually don't know of an old building that was renovated that put anywhere on the map. So I don't think we can do it with the building that you've already decided. I think that we need a new building. So let's go scouting for sites in the city. And they went up on a mountaintop and looked down on the city, and they saw an old derelict site from an old, an old factory on the river, right in the middle of Bilbao. And Gary said, "Can we get that site?" And they checked, and they could get that site, and that's where the Bilbao is built today. So not in the place and not in the building that they originally planned, because Gary actually has this thing that he always asks people, why are you doing this? And the answer to the question why was that they really wanted to be put on the map. And Gary said, hey, in my experience, you can't put a city on the map by renovating an old building. I don't know any examples of that. If you don't know any examples of that, why do you think you can be the first to do it in the world? That takes a lot of self-confidence. But we have examples of new buildings that actually put things on the map. So that's an example, where this kind of thinking really made a difference.
Yeah. It's, I think, something that challenges us to really lean into one of the values that we celebrate in this administration for the department, which is imagination. And I think being imaginative about our purposes can really help us identify the most effective ways to get things done, even if it's a little different than the vision that we've inherited. Let me ask about patterns that you found across things that have gone well, because I think part of what brings us to this discussion is a widespread understanding that big projects rarely go well. At least they rarely go well by the metrics that we're setting out of happening on time, meeting the intended purpose, and happening on budget. I think your data set suggests that something on the order of 2% or less of mega projects actually go that way. But you've also looked at so many big projects that there are quite a few that did go well. And so I wonder if you could share some more examples of things that went right, and some of the patterns that you observed that those projects had in common as they beat the odds and proved, despite their scale or complexity, to come in on time, to do what they were supposed to do, and to cost what they were supposed to cost, or maybe even a little less.
Yeah. So we have data on more than 16,000 projects, and even though it's a small percentage that are successful, it's still enough, when you have that big a database, that we can find success stories and try to learn from them, which is something we put a lot of effort into, because it's really important to learn not just from your failures, but also from your successes. Even though, as everybody knows who's doing startups, it actually is important to learn from your failures, but it's not enough. You need the successes also. So let's look at what goes into a successful project. And it actually turns out that the successful projects are successful in the same manner, that they have things in common. So one thing is, of course, they have gone through this slow thinking process that we just talked about, that the people who are clients, the owners, the sponsors of the projects, and the people who are leading the projects know this thing about that they need to go slow. They have to be careful not to get anxious about being slow in the beginning, which is actually a natural human reaction. We just want to get going, and we get anxious if people are talking too much about things and so on. Hey, let's just quit the talking and get going. So experienced leaders know that that's not the way to go, because they've done it, they've tried it, and they have the scars to prove, that it doesn't work, and they therefore do it differently. So that's one thing successful projects have in common, that they have a quite extended period up front. It varies from project to project, how long it is. But for instance, Pixar will spend 2 years in development before they actually start shooting a movie. And this is thinking slow the Pixar way. We just talked about Frank Gehry. He'll also spend typically 2 years before a major project, iterating, experimenting. It's not like you don't do anything and that you only think. There's actually a lot of practical action going on, where you simulate the project, you build the project on computers before you build it in reality. It's a great way to learn if you have good building information models, as it's called, and that's what we see with successful project leaders, that they do this thing. They simulate, they experiment, and They have very experienced leaders in charge. They have a lot of back and forth, getting feedback from other experienced leaders so that they don't do the project in isolation. They make sure to get lots of information from the outside. This is another thing where we see the projects that don't go well, they have a tendency to sort of close themselves in a bubble and not have too much contact with the outside world. A lot of projects actually make the error of thinking that their project is unique. And if you think your project is unique, why should you talk to other projects? Because you don't have anything to learn from the other projects. And this is what we call uniqueness bias. It's very widespread. So the successful projects don't suffer from uniqueness bias. They actually know that our project, no matter how special it is, it's one of those. It's a type of project. And we need to talk to other people who are doing this type of project in order to have the best possible information that we can get. So those are some of the things that go into that. So, but I would say the two key words are simulation and experimentation, where you actually simulate the project before you build it.
So on that uniqueness bias, I think that's something that's so interesting in transportation, because everything we work on is both unique and part of a class, but it depends on how you think of it. There's certainly only one Hudson River tunnel. There's only one California high-speed rail north to south project of the type that's being done, and it's the first of its kind to put actual physical construction into U.S. soil. And every town, there's only one of that particular town, and yet so many things do fall into a type. I wonder if you could share a little more about how to actively move from thinking about something as though it were the only one of its kind to finding what could be a broader class of projects that could compare when it's not obvious, right? When it's not a road project of a type that somebody will know that they've done 12 others like it, but where it really does feel, at least, like it's the only one of its kind when you're first taking it up.
Well, the famous American anthropologist Margaret Mead told her students, each of them, you're unique like everybody else. And it's the same with you, Mr. Secretary, and me. We are both unique individuals, right? And I'm sure our parents would say that we are unique, and every parent would say about their kids that they are unique. But that hasn't stopped the profession of medicine, or the science of medicine, to make great progress in studying the human organism, the human whatever part of the body, and so on. And we need to think the same way about projects. So even if there's only one Hudson Tunnel, there are literally thousands of tunnels around the world, and to think that you can build a tunnel without taking the experience into account from all these other tunnels, that's hubris, and you are going to get punished if you commit that hubris. So the way you benefit from other projects is by studying what the projects have in common. So, for instance, the iron law that we talked about earlier, that project tends to come in over budget, over schedule, and under benefits, that's something that projects have in common. To different degrees, it varies between project types, but it's something they have in common. So you can actually use statistics from other projects to estimate the risks of your projects. That's one thing you can do. There's also all sorts of techniques and methodologies for design and for construction, that where the experience is shared across lots of projects, and you can learn a lot from others. And again, if you don't take that learning into account, you're just going to perform worse. You're really putting yourself in a position that you don't need to put yourself in, where you are increasing the risk that your project is going to fail enormously if you don't benefit from all the learning that is out there.
You also mentioned the human factor of experience, and on this in this convening right now, we have some remarkably and wonderfully experienced transportation leaders. We also have people who are probably newer to project delivery. And if you think about the United States as a country, on one hand, a country that is, of course, very experienced in the general sense of at having built every form of infrastructure and pioneered many of them, and on the other hand, almost by definition, we do not as a country have the experience of doing this kind of once in a generation nationwide infrastructure investment intended to make up for about 50 years of lost time and to prepare us for the next 50 years, including considerations that were not much part of the picture in past generations, like climate change. And I would add to that considerations about equity that are very important to us as an administration, but are certainly not in the kind of experience that is physically captured in the existing infrastructure we've inherited. So I wonder what conclusions you might draw or you might offer to the people here who are gearing up to deliver so much work on how best to assign and organize both leaders and teams to make the most of experience where experience is needed, but also to build experience where it isn't necessarily there yet.
Right. So first of all, the US has a very proud tradition delivering infrastructure, and in the first half of the 20th century, there were a long period where enormous amount of infrastructure was built in the US, and a lot of it very successfully, including by the standards of the rest of the world, where the United States actually became a model to follow. So just take hydroelectric dams. The US was before the rest of the world, and the rest of the world actually imitated the United States when they got to build hydroelectric dams. So like the Hoover Dam is the archetypical example here. And it's I think that's a proud project, and we can still learn from it. We actually talk about that in our book. We talk about the Hoover Dam and other American projects like that. So I think that there is a tradition to learn from in the United States. Of course, it's different today. So there are all these other things like the equity issues, social issues, environmental issues that needs to be taken into account that make things different. But that's possible. That is doable. So what are good leaders and good teams in this kind of situation? And I think you are absolutely right to mention both leaders and their teams in the same breath, because every good leader that I've ever talked to always do that. They always emphasize their team. A good leader is, worth very little on their own. They can't do anything without their team. So we need both. If we start with the leader, however, we call them master builders, and we had tried to identify master builders, and we define master builders as people who have a track record, a proven track record. They can actually deliver the projects that they are responsible for, not following the iron law, so actually on budget, on time, and with or more than the expected benefits. That's a master builder. And that's basically the kind of person that you want to look for. And so you want somebody with a track record that proves they can actually deliver the project that you're now considering hiring them for doing. And I would say, Mr. Secretary and everybody else who's listening, if you can't find somebody with a track record for the project that you are doing, don't do the project. It's that simple, because you're going to have enormous risk of going wrong if you let somebody, develop their skills on your project, skills that they don't have already. And we have seen many examples of this where you hire somebody from a different sector, let's say somebody from oil and gas, to do a transportation project. It doesn't go well. So you need at least the principal leader of the project to be somebody with a proven track record, so they can document they've already done this several times successfully. That's the leader you want to look for. That's typically an experienced leader, typically an older leader. I'm always saying that gray hair is an asset in our field. That doesn't mean that young people are not very important. Of course they are, and they can bring things. Especially in this IT age that we live in, they can bring things that are really important. But don't underestimate experience. Experience is extremely important for being successful. Again, something we developed at length in the book, that just in addition to experiments, you need experience. And these two words actually come from the same root, experire, Latin words. And these are two things that you need in your project. So experience. And then you need to let the master builder, the leader, choose their team to the extent possible. I know that this is not always possible, and a lot of people, when I say this, they say, "Well, Ben, we don't get to choose our teams. They're basically given to us." Well, maybe you need to look at that and start thinking about how do we make teams that are more tailor-made to the leader of the project and to the project itself. So instead of mechanically thinking like, hey, a team is a team is a team, which is a mistake, that's an error, that's a fallacy to think that any team is as good as any other team. You start thinking more specifically, what kind of team, which persons, and so on. And here, the right place to ask is the master builder. I know examples of successful project leaders who will actually make it a condition for them taking on a project when they are asked that they can bring a certain number of key people from their team that they work with on every project. So that's the thing we see across projects. And back to talking about success, the successful projects and the successful leaders work with the same partners and stakeholders over and over again, sometimes over 20, 30, 40 years, and they become better and better, because that's actually the way you get really good, is by doing the same type of project with the same people over and over.
You mentioned the risk associated with not having the right leadership, and I want to dwell a little bit on the topic of risk, because I think just about everybody involved in delivery is on some level managing risk for a living. But we also know that often there's a failure to address risk early or anticipate risk, which can lead to overruns and project schedules being prolonged. One example you cite is not from a multi-billion-dollar project, but a home improvement project that it winds up being emblematic for those who experienced it, of things that you do see in these larger contexts. So I wonder what thoughts you might have on how to get your arms around risk early, how to map and identify risk, and how not to be paralyzed by risk when you're undertaking projects that are going to be risky on some level, so that we can get those better outcomes and hit our marks in terms of time and budget.
That may be the single most important question, because these projects are very risky. And we have some new research that is just beginning to come out that shows a completely new thing that people haven't been aware of before. And that is that your transport infrastructure projects and many other types of projects, including the building renovation that you mentioned, are fat-tailed. So this is what statisticians call fat-tailed, which means that they have many extreme outcomes. So if we're talking about cost, the costs explode often in this type of project. That's what generates the fat tail for cost. The schedule blows up and the benefits underperform. And we are now documenting that these projects are fat-tailed, including transportation infrastructure. So that's incredibly important if you're talking about risk management. When you have fat tails, that's like a red warning light going on, that you need to pay special attention. And there are two things you need to do in order to manage risk. You need to look at the whole risk distribution, the whole curve. You can't use the averages. This is a bit technical, but fat-tail distributions don't have reliable averages, period. So forget about the average. You need to look at the whole probability distribution for risk. And then, part of that you can cover by contingencies, like you put aside 20, 30, 40% contingency, and then you have that money when things start to go wrong, and you don't have to go out and raise additional funding and so on. And that's a big security for the project team. If they have contingencies like that, they can draw on if they have good reasons to draw on them. But actually, part of that probability distribution you cannot cover with contingencies, because the contingencies would have to be way too high, 300-400%, in some cases even higher. IT is just totally off the chart. You might need 800% if you were going by contingencies. And of course, that's not practical. So the second thing you want to do, in addition to having contingencies for maybe the first 80% of the risk curve, the fat tail, the last 20%, you need to do what we call black swan management. So black swans is a metaphor for the extreme values. They're called black swan. You want to eliminate the black swans. You want to cut the tail. And we have developed methods for doing that. In the book, we give an example how this is done for high-speed rail 2, which is the equivalent of the California high-speed rail project, which is being built in the UK here right now, and where we were involved in the risk management and risk assessment. And we did this specific exercise of cutting the tail of the project in order to avoid ending up in the fat tail. So those are the two things. You look at the whole probability distribution of risk, You use contingencies to protect yourself on the milder risk, and for the wild risk, you use black swan management.
One feature of really any large public sector projects, certainly transportation projects in the United States, is the expectation and the requirement, which we enforce through NEPA rules, of adequate community and stakeholder engagement. And I think on one hand, we often find that this process is sometimes the vessel into which people pour all of their anxiety or frustration about project timelines. And on the other hand, we found that if you don't go through that process the right way, you actually increase your risk of controversy, litigation, opposition, or delay toward the end of the planning timeline. So I wonder what your research might show about what happens in the relationship between the project and those who are working on it and everybody else that's important to know about community engagement and stakeholder engagement. Not only from the perspective of doing the right thing socially and democratically, but also just in terms of doing the right thing for the project development to go well.
So first observation is that you can't avoid it. I mean, if you try to avoid it, you will end up, like you say, that you really put your project at risk. So it's actually about risk management too, in addition to all the other things that it's about. So stakeholder engagement is crucial. And again, if we look at the successful project leaders and the successful projects, they put a lot of emphasis on this. They take it as seriously as the design of the project. They take it as seriously as all the cost-benefit analysis, the environmental impact analysis, the social impact analysis. Stakeholder engagement is at the same level. So you want everybody who's impacted by the project or who might impact the project. So both ways, who are impacted and might impact your project. Those are the people that you want to deal with. And one thing I've observed that I find really interesting is that the really successful project leaders and projects actually pay extra attention to the people who are really harmed by the project. So let's say people who have to move. I mean, you have a new right-of-way, you're putting in a new road, or you're putting in a new rail line, as is the case with the California high-speed rail example. And some people, traumatically have to move maybe from their community, and their house will be torn down and so on. It's a tragedy for many people. And it's actually impossible to build projects without things like that happening. Some projects turn their back on this because these people are going to become, very strong critics of what you're doing, and they will do everything they can to undermine you. Of course, it's a natural reaction. Those are the people that you really want to spend time on and make the biggest effort to help. It's like simply hire people whose job it is to take care of stakeholders like that. We have examples of projects like that. I have an example with a big bridge that were built where they had to tear down 126 homes. They hired a person to go around and talk to each family in those 126 homes. They ended up, being able to explain what they were doing, and they compensated people in a way that was fair, and they treated them with respect. They didn't. It's easier, and we have an inclination. If somebody becomes our enemy, we want to turn our back to them. And stakeholders like that appear to be your enemy when you're doing a project. Of course, they see you as their enemy for good reasons, and then you start seeing them as your enemy from the project organization's point of view. Now, if you end up in that situation, then you've already lost. You need to make a situation like the one I described. You get people employed whose job it is to take care of these people. You make sure there's a compensation scheme where the compensation is fair, so people won't say that, hey, I actually didn't get the value of my home and so on. And that's peanuts, to pay a fair price for 146 homes on a multi-billion-dollar project. It doesn't matter, basically. So there's lots of scope, and we've seen that on projects around the world, in Asia, in Europe, in the United States, that if you do it this way, if you think about stakeholder management in this way, first of all, it makes your job much more interesting, also much more challenging, but also you will be more successful.
I think this is a really important point, because too often we fall into a suggestion that it's really engagement versus delivery, that anything you do to do the right thing, to engage the community or to engage people who are impacted, is somehow coming at the expense of moving quickly and getting something done. And I think in some ways that that perception has become even more pronounced when some draw attention to less inclusive societies and how they can get infrastructure done in a quick, but I would argue less durable and ultimately less robust way by just ignoring or rolling over people. And so I think this really brings together this fact that there's actually not just a compatibility, but a dependency between proper, good, inclusive engagement and good, strong, timely delivery. That's actually a feature of what President Biden often describes as the importance of demonstrating that democracies can do well, we would hope can do best at delivery of the basics, and that it's not just a quote unquote soft concern. We're going to soon open up to questions from the audience. So I think I'll just put one more question to you before we do that. But one thing that is handy is that you've kept a list of what you call heuristics for better project leadership, more kind of memorable rules of thumb to manage by. And I wonder, one of them you referred to earlier, hire a master builder. And I wonder if there are others that you think might be especially applicable to this audience that is now in the thick of working on delivering the projects and the funds created by this infrastructure law.
Yeah, I'm Danish. I didn't mention that, but I'm Danish, and Lego. I think everybody knows Lego. Lego is a Danish toy. You know, every Dane grew up with stepping on Legos in their homes all the time and hurting their feet. But I would say this is a heuristic built with Legos. So that's a metaphor, obviously, but it's about built with modularity. And this actually, so we have documented this, and again, this is research that is ongoing. Some of it is in the book, but we get some very clear results that if you can do your projects in a modular way, you actually eliminate the tail risks. They disappear. So you are reducing your risk tremendously, and you increase your speed, which actually explains why the risk goes away. The shorter the time you take to do something, the smaller a risk you will actually face. And so make sure that transport infrastructure projects that you think in an innovative way and think, what's my Lego? Like when we're doing this project, what's the Lego in this project, or the Legos? It doesn't have to be just one thing. Even Lego is not just one thing. You know, there are many different types of building blocks. And but that's the way to think about it. And those Legos, you produce them in factories, not on site. You need to get rid of this construction site. Actually, the word construction site should be abolished from the language, you know, and we should have assembly sites. Not until we get assembly sites will infrastructure and construction be really rational processes where you can control the cost and the schedule and so on. It's just too hard to build things out in the open. You need to bring it into factories. And then, you know, you bring the parts that you built in the factories onto the assembly site, and then you assemble things. So that's the first heuristic, I would say, build with Lego, or just ask yourself, what's my Lego? And it's very important for transportation infrastructure, because transportation infrastructure and construction in general is a bit behind the rest of society in standardizing things and manufacturing things. So many other parts of society, they would never accept, you know, that you build things on site. Just think of the auto industry. If they showed up in your driveway and built your car, they don't do that. You build a finished car, right? And then you drive it home. So that's one thing. Another one that I would recommend is make every project about climate. That doesn't mean that the project cannot be about other things, but we live in a situation now where we have to think climate into everything. And again, it's possible. And again, actually, climate benefits very much from modular thinking. One of the reasons that the wind industry and the solar industry is so successful these days, with the cost of electricity plummeting, you know, over time, is because they are totally modular. So what's a solar panel? It's totally modular around the solar cell. You put the panels into an array, you have an array, you put a lot of arrays together, you have a solar farm, completely modular from the smallest part to the largest part. And if you don't have enough in one solar farm, you just build another one, and in exactly the same way. The fact that they're so standardized, produced in factories and so on, mean that you can deliver them effectively. We need to think in transportation more like people do in the energy sector now. So the energy sector have actually leapfrogged transportation in this sense, and we can do it. There's no question about it. This is where where innovation, Mr. Secretary, will come in and the most, and where it will have a huge impact on the environment, because things that can be manufactured like that, modularized, have lesser environmental impact than things that cannot and can be done faster. And then the last example of heuristic is, and this one is really important, and maybe the most important in behavioral terms, is your biggest risk is you. And I don't mean you personally, Mr. Secretary. I mean you and everybody on your team. You are your own biggest risks. If you don't think about all the things that we have talked about here and then some, if you are subject to all these cognitive biases that are demonstrated in behavioral science that we all are subject to, and you do not take it into account, then you will actually increase the risk of your projects tremendously. And that's actually why we see such poor performance, is because people think that risk is something that is out there, that is something, it's the weather, it's the geology, it's the steel price, and so on. And all those things are real. I'm not saying they don't exist, but actually it's our misconception of all these things that is the biggest problem. That's why I'm saying your biggest risk is you, and please do take that in.
That's a very good challenge, and also a very good note, I think, to bring in more of the voices of the participants. So let me return it to Anne to guide the audience Q&A portion of our hour.
Thank you both for tremendous dialogue. We could easily go on for another hour. We have way more questions than we're going to be able to take. But for those of you who we don't get to, please be assured that we'll take your thoughts into account as we structure the Project Delivery Center of Excellence. So, Professor, the first question that came in says, I've long been interested in Professor's research in optimism bias. And I'm wondering if you could just speak a little about the trends you're seeing in this research and any advice you'd offer us as we seek to administer mega projects and major projects across the modes.
Sure. And so optimism bias is considered the most important behavioral bias. So Danny Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, a professor at Princeton University, he says that this is the most important cognitive bias. I was originally invited by actually the UK Department for Transportation to work on optimism bias way back in the 2000s by the Treasury and the Department for Transportation, because they saw optimism in the transport infrastructure project. So the work on optimism bias in project management actually grew out of the transportation fields. So we're right at home here. And again, you know, we are hardwired to be optimists. Very few people are not optimists. And we have the optimism for good reasons, that it's actually a good thing to be optimistic if you want to get through life, even if you want to get up in the morning, if you want to get married, have kids, you know, whatever. It takes optimism to do projects, you know, to spend $1.2 trillion. You need optimism, you know, to make sure to convince yourself that you can do it. So optimism is a great thing. I don't want to be misunderstood when I say that optimism is a problem, but it is a problem because optimism can be misplaced. Just think of yourself if you were getting on a plane and you overhear the first pilot saying to the second pilot, I'm optimistic about the fuel situation. You don't want to get on that plane. You don't want to get on a plane with a pilot who's optimistic about the fuel situation. So that's an example of misplaced optimism. The fuel on our project is the money. I don't want to do a project with somebody who's optimistic about the budget. It's going to end bad. You know, you're going to run out of money. You're going to have to spend your time raising more money and so on. The same with the schedule. We're optimistic about schedules. Well, if you're optimistic about your schedule, you're going to have a schedule overrun. So it's actually an important prerequisite. And this goes into the slow thinking, that in the slow thinking phase, you think about what are the biases that might be at play here, and optimism bias is your main candidate. And then you ask, how do we de-bias our project? How do we de-bias our business case? And we have developed very good tools for doing that. They're being used on thousands of projects around the world these days. This is actually probably the part of my research and my team's research that has been the most successful with having direct policy and practice impact.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Another questioner asks, based on your observations about master builders, how how does the private sector, and I would say also the public sector, develop those master builders if you only want experienced builders on your project? We have a generation of civil engineers retiring, and we must develop new leadership. Do you have any thoughts?
That is absolutely true. We must develop new leadership. We must have training. That's actually why I came to Oxford. So Oxford University saw this a long time ago. In 2007, 2008, they realized, they were contacted by industry, actually. Industry contacted the university and said, we have a problem. We actually don't have enough people who know how to do this, to do big projects. And we need a serious university to start a program in this. And Oxford University decided that they would do that, and then they hired me, from Denmark. I was headhunted from Denmark to Oxford University to start this program. So these are the kinds of programs that we need. And I've actually been surprised to see, because this program is extremely successful and profitable at Oxford University. So I wonder why hasn't Harvard or MIT or Stanford, copied this, to make a similar bunch of money, out of this kind of program. And this is something that the United States could do more in my view, like get training going. And I'm not talking about undergraduate or traditional graduate students here. I'm talking about taking people in the middle of their career, which is what we do at Oxford and in Copenhagen, take people in the middle of their career and then expose them to the kind of ideas that we are talking about here much more systematically, and giving them the tools so they can actually go out on their teams and use these tools and this kind of thinking in order to make their projects run better. So we do have a huge shortage of labor, actually at every level, not only leaders, but at every level in infrastructure and construction. And this is something that we need to look to, and the educational sector, I think, has a big responsibility here. But it helps if we get nudged from the outside. If somebody tells us, like what happened in Oxford, somebody from the outside tells us, you need to look at this, you need to do something here.
Can't help but editorialize that this is an interesting space for the federally funded Center of Excellence at Volpe to be thinking about too, is how to connect.
It's definitely something.
So add that to the things we're asking you to think through. Consider
it added. And I would just like to personally observe, I loved your think of it as a Lego analogy. I think that describes very well the accelerated bridge construction program that Federal Highway introduced a number of years ago. We need to do more of that. One questioner is asking what you recommend in terms of alternative contracting methods to best address risk and work more collaboratively. Recognizing that may require legislative changes in many states, but
this is one of the most difficult questions, is contracting, and it's also one of the most important ones. Just like I mentioned, risk is one of the most important ones, and it's a real hard nut, to untie. What kind of contract is the best contract? And I think the answer is that there isn't one contract that would be the best contract. So I would say if you work with very experienced people, so you have a very experienced team and they are working with builders they work with before that are also very experienced in these specific projects, you should actually do a partnering contract, like what was done for Heathrow's Terminal 5, that the client, the sponsor actually takes on all the risk, and you just hire people in to do the job, because you don't want the fight over who's to blame when something goes wrong. You don't want this risk blaming, and that people say, no, it's not my risk, it's your risk. So they push the risk back and forth between them, often ending up in arbitration or worse, in courts, which is very common on construction projects. That happens, unfortunately. So for a mature client and a mature project organization, I would say partnering contracts is the way to go. But it's very rare. They are the minority. The majority of contracts are still contracts that is some variation of lowest bids, and then the contractor is taking all or the majority of the risk, ending up in the game of pushing risk between the sponsor and the contractor, which is unfortunate. In the UK and in other places where we work, I think in the US too, there's experimentation going on. You actually experiment with different contracts. And At one stage, it was mandatory in Europe that you had to take the lowest bids. Fortunately, both the European Union and individual member states have found out that this is not a good idea. Actually, you have to give the freedom to the people who are doing the tendering process to actually choose somebody who's not the lowest bidder, if you know that contractor is going to be the best contractor. And it's very important to realize that the lowest bid typically doesn't translate into the lowest final cost. So those kinds of contracts can be poison, to projects, and luckily they're not mandatory anymore. So we are moving more and more away from those kind of lowest price contract into contracts that are more nuanced, where you can actually take into account the quality of the contract, the quality of the work, their experience, and so on, which I think is the way to go. But that's a gradual process, and we need continued experimentation with contracts.
I think that is such an incredibly important point that it's maybe a good point to end on. I wonder if either of you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share. I know I just deviated from program. You don't have to have closing thoughts, but this has been such an engaging dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
So
yeah, Professor. Let me ask if there's anything you might want to say just to bring it all together before
I just want to thank you one more time for having me. And I want to say that I hope that this is the beginning of a relationship and not the end of the relationship.
Absolutely. And thank you both for inspiring us with your energy and your optimism. If I don't want to misuse that word. I'd also like to give a shout out to the team that put today's event together and is standing up the Project Delivery Center of Excellence. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. Please take a minute, if you haven't already, and give us any feedback or ideas, what you'd like to see. The Center of Excellence is being developed to serve you, so let us know what you'd like to see. Our next event will be held next Thursday, August 3rd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We hope you can register and join us. The session is Thinking Outside the Box, Innovating for Better Project Delivery. And the speakers will be Carlos Braceras, Executive Director of the Utah Department of Transportation, and Paula Hammond, who's the current chair of the American Road and Transport Builders Association and Senior Vice President of WSP USA. So we hope to see you all next week. The session is recorded, so if you want to go back and listen to it again, or if you have colleagues who were not able to be with us, please direct them to the site. And thank you for the very insightful comments that you've already entered in the Q&A box.
Thanks very much, Anne. Thank you, Professor, for sharing time with us, and agreed we would love to stay in touch. Anne and everybody at Volpe and everybody working on this, thanks for your attention to delivery. And everybody who's part of this, thanks in advance. You are the ones who are going to be really the tip of the spear on whether this generational project delivers on the value that the president, and for that matter, the public, expect of us. And I'll think about the word optimism a little differently after today, but I have the highest hopes and expectations for what we're going to be able to do together. And I know we'll make good on that potential. So thanks, everybody. Keep in touch, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.